Hey nerds, just Jamie here with
your friend Claude.
And this is Nerd Bomber vs. Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. Today's movies are connected in a variety of ways. The person who suggested this pair up was Claude, so why don't you tell us a little bit about why you want to see these two movies go up against each other?
Well, they both feature blonde, muscular protagonists, and they're both very similar in nature in terms of grand adventure tales, sort of a space theme, I guess. However, one of them goes from Earth to space, while the other one goes from space to Earth.
Fair enough. So we should probably at this point mention what these movies are.
Why not?
They are 1980's Flash Gordon and 1987's Masters of the Universe. So those are the movies that Claude suggested. He already gave you his reasons. I told you what they are. We're going to step away. I'm going to come back and give you the basics. All right, here I am. So let's talk basics for today's movies. Up first is 1980's Flash Gordon. Directing, we have Mike Hodges. Hodges is known for the original Get Carter, as well as The Terminal Man and Black Rainbow, in addition to this movie. Writing, we have Lorenzo Semple Jr., who's mostly known for doing spy movie thrillers such as The Parallax View and 3 Days of the Condor, as well as episodes of the 1960s Batman series. Of course, this whole thing is an adaptation of the Flash Gordon comic strips, which were created by Alex Raymond, and they started in 1934. The music for this movie is handled by the all-time great classic rock band Queen, as well as Howard Blake, who didn't do much in film. He was a longtime concert pianist and composer with a 50-year career. All right, so let's talk cast. First up, as the title hero, Flash Gordon, is Sam Jones. Jones started as a semi-professional football player and a model before starting in acting. He got jobs in various TV shows and B-movies. This role is by far his most significant and well-known part. Next, we have Melody Anderson as fellow accidental space traveler Dale Arden. This movie is also Anderson's most well-known credit, although she did appear in other films such as Dead and Buried and many TV shows like Manimal. Now we get to the heavy hitters in supporting roles. First among them is Max von Sydow as the villain Ming the Merciless. Von Sydow was a Hollywood legend known for roles in The Greatest Story Ever Told, as well as The Exorcist, and all the way up to more recent roles in things like Game of Thrones and Star Wars The Force Awakens. That's among many, many, many things that he did before his death at 90 years of age in 2020. Next is legendary stage actor Brian Blessed, bringing his imposing physical presence and booming voice to the part of Prince Voltan of the Hawkmen. Between TV, film, and stage roles, Blessed's career is too extensive to even hint at, but I encourage anyone interested in that sort of thing to take a look at his career because it's pretty interesting. Last up in the main cast, we have Timothy Dalton as the swashbuckling Prince Baron, who is very much an iteration of a Robin Hood type character. Dalton is most known, of course, for playing James Bond in several 007 movies, among many other well-known roles. Okay, so Dino De Laurentiis was the producer of this film. He had been interested in adapting Flash Gordon into film as far back as the 60s. He originally went to Italian director Federico Fellini, but Fellini never made the film. George Lucas wanted to make the movie, but he couldn't get the rights from De Laurentiis, so he ended up going to make a little film called Star Wars instead. Next up was Nicholas Roeg. Roeg actually did a lot of design and conceptual work on the film, but he left the project, and when Sergio Leone was unable to take over, Hodges finally came on board, and the film was made. All right, so pop culture footprint, not bad at the time, actually. The film was a nominal box office success, actually, as Claude will discuss in a moment. There were toys, there was pinball, there was an Atari 2600 video game, a comic adaptation, a novelization. In recent years, the film has developed a significant cult following among fans, with filmmakers such as Edgar Wright and comic artists like Alex Ross citing it as major influences in their current work. All right, so next up is 1987's Masters of the Universe, based, of course, on the iconic 1980s toy line and animated series. Directing here is Gary Goddard. As a director, Goddard is actually known for doing theme park rides, but he's most well known as the co-founder of the Landmark Entertainment Group. David Odell gets screenwriting credit here. Odell has appeared on the show before for his involvement with The Dark Crystal. He is also known for Supergirl and for working on The Muppet Show, as I probably mentioned in that episode as well. All right, music here is by Bill Conti. Conti has been involved in several high-profile film series, including Rocky and The Karate Kid, as well as movies For Your Eyes Only and The Right Stuff. All right, so the cast for this one, leading the way as the most powerful man in the universe, He-Man, is Dolph Lundgren. Lundgren is obviously most well known as Ivan Drago from Rocky IV, in addition to many, many B-level action movies and the occasional big-budget production, but this is probably his next most well-known part after Ivan Drago. Next up in one of her very first roles is Courtney Cox as Earthling Julie Winston. Cox is obviously most well known as one of the stars of the sitcom Friends and for the film series Scream. All right, next up we have Frank Langella chewing the scenery as the villainous Skeletor. Langella had a long, distinguished career, but this movie stands out for its sort of genre absurdity. But he's actually on record for having a very positive attitude about it. He wanted to do it, and he liked doing it. All right, so finishing off the main cast, we have Barry Livingston as Charlie. We have James Tolkan as Detective Lubick. We have Christina Pickles as Sorceress. We have Meg Foster as Evelyn, Chelsea Field as Tila, John Cipher as Man-at-Arms, and finally, the legendary Billy Barty as Gwildor. All right, so production of this film was labored. Toy maker Mattel was very invasive early on, limiting the things that they would allow the character of He-Man to do and the ways that he could be represented. It is also rumored that as the Canon Film Group began to overextend itself, Mattel became reticent to provide their portion of the production budget. This forced the filmmakers to create a climax for the film with a skeleton crew, essentially no budget to work with. At the time that the Canon Group began to fail, sales of the toy line began to fall. So all of this added to the general thought among the cast and crew and others that this film was silly, absurd, and just not very good. So this film was kind of in a tough spot from the start. Alrighty, pop culture footprint. At the time, this movie was a failure. It didn't do well at the box office, and because of its troubled production and the part it played in Canon's failure, it was generally thought of as kind of a Hollywood punchline for a long time. In recent years, it has gained a cult following, but there has never been any significant movement in terms of sequels, remakes, or anything like that. Okay, I think that's basically it for the basics for these two films. I'm going to forfeit the main seat, and Claude's going to take over with a tale of the tape.
A battle fought in the stars now comes to Earth.
Police! Nobody move! I think I'm gonna need some backup.
A battle for the power.
Kneel before your master!
To be masters of the universe. Dolph Lundgren is He-Man. Frank Langella is Skeletor.
Let this be our final battle!
Masters of the universe. Rated PG.
Now playing at a theater near you.
Greetings, fight fans and movie buffs. I am your friend Claude, here with tonight's Tale of the Tape for our main event of the evening between our two contenders, Flash Gordon and Masters of the Universe. Well, this installment shall be no different than any ones that preceded it, because we're starting with the distributing studio. For Flash Gordon, it was the legendary Hollywood studio Universal Pictures. And for Masters of the Universe, it was that legendarily infamous Hollywood studio, the Canon Group. As far as the ratings go, these movies are evenly matched. They are both PG films, and luckily they are both PG films in an era when things were still a bit broad in the category. Nothing too adult here, but certainly a bit more room to play at that rating level. As far as running times, well, Flash Gordon comes in at 114 minutes, while Masters of the Universe clocks 106 minutes. Not terribly different, not to mismatch in the battle thus far. When you look at release dates, Flash Gordon came out December 5th of 1980, whereas Masters of the Universe came out August 7th of 1987. These are different seasonal movies, but I don't know that it affects much of what came afterwards, which includes the budgets. They're almost dead even in this category as well. Flash Gordon was made for anywhere between 20 and 27 million. And you can roughly extrapolate 23 and a half if you kind of want to, take the middle ground. And Masters of the Universe came in at 22 million. So they're almost even as far as that goes. However, Flash Gordon was basically able to double their money, coming in at $46.5 million in profit, whereas Masters of the Universe wishes it had been able to do the same. And that only brought in about $17 million, unfortunately. So they're both securely cult movies, but one of them doesn't have to hang its head in quite the level of shame that the other one does when you look back on it. However, I am proud to say that I like both of these movies, and perhaps coming up, you will see why. This has been tonight's Tale of the Tape. Now let's open the doors and settle some scores.
All right, we're back, and it's time for our first set of scores. This will be for 1980's Flash Gordon, and I think it's my turn to go first, and so I will. For visuals, I'm going 8.5. Very high score. I love the way this movie looks. I had slept on this movie for a long time. Hadn't seen it until probably within the last 3 years was the first time I actually ever saw this movie. I had known about it for a long time. I stayed away from it because I thought it was mostly silly camp. And I mean, it is that, but it's highfalutin camp. Because
Silliness is in the eye of the beholder.
well, that's true too. And maybe in recent years I've become a lot more, that's become more palatable to me in general. But anyway, yeah, 8.5. I mean, the matte paintings look great. The costumes look great. The set decoration looks great. The special effects are okay, but mostly this is about production design. And production design is awesome, off the charts, love it. I mean, this movie, I'm a huge fan of this movie. It's a more fun, I compare it a lot to Dune, both very lavish. The original Dune, that is, David Lynch's Dune, or, Alan Smithy's Dune. But this is sort of a more fun version of that. It's every bit as impressive in a movie that's a lot more lighthearted and more adventure-based, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, very high score for me, 8.5 for visuals. Next up, performances. I go down a little bit. I go to 7.5. This is mostly carried by the supporting cast. You have Von Sydow, Brian Blessed, and Timothy Dalton, really, I think, carrying the load in terms of performances. Sam Jones does an admirable job as the hunky hero, but he's not sort of like a fine actor. He's playing the heroic dude, and he's doing that well enough. Yeah. These performances are carried by those by that supporting cast of sort of more iconic, legendary actors. Max von Sydow is a lot of fun. Timothy Dalton is very charismatic. Brian Blessed blows the doors off the place just whenever he walks into the room. So 7.5 for performances for me. Writing, taking a hit here. I'm going all the way down to 5. The movie is tonally, again, I like the camp, I like the fun. But the movie is a little bit tonally uneven. The dialogue is a little bit clunky at times. Some of the concepts are a little strange. There's literally like a football fight in the middle of a space tyrant's main hall. It's hard to sort of get by. That's a little level of silliness probably farther than they needed to go, and that's a writing issue. So yeah, a little bit clunky in the writing. So taking a hit, 5, but obviously some of my other scores are pretty good. So overall, it doesn't hurt the film too much actually. And then finally, audio. Again, I'm going 7.5. The audio is well balanced. It's you can hear everything well. The dialogue doesn't get lost in the mix. Doesn't go up and down wildly. The soundtrack is good. Obviously, the soundtrack is dominated obviously by Queen.
Yeah.
Everybody knows, Queen, the Flash Gordon song, as well as others. That's very recognizable. But also the score of the film is very good. I mean, this is by an accomplished guy, and he's got experience doing sort of very well-known, high-level, A-list Hollywood films, and it shows in this movie because it's just it's a little bit more high-quality work than this film probably even needed to have. So that stands on its own. So, and Queen is great. I love that. I don't want to downplay that. it's great, and I like that, and that's a part of why I get it. It gets a pretty good score from me, but the score is sometimes overlooked, and I think that just deserves a little recognition. So yeah, 7.5 for audio. So those are my 4 scores: 8.5, 7.5, 5, 7.5. Over to you.
I'm going to go even higher on the visuals.
Fair enough.
Another half point up. I'm going to start out with a 9.
I respect it.
Because as much as you like them, clearly I do as well. Evidently just that much more. I too was... I didn't necessarily actively avoid seeing this movie. I just hadn't. And, I was aware of it, but it was never anything where I was like, oh, I really have to go out of my way. And then just kind of was at my cousin's house one night. He put it on, and he was like, you really should see this. So I did, and I was blown away, actually, by what I saw visually. For the time period, 20-something million is nothing to sneeze at. Mm-hmm. I think the foreign production elements kind of are usually associated with smaller budget affairs, so maybe it creates this impression that they were on a shoestring or something, but clearly they put a lot into how this movie looks, especially the costumes, especially the different set locations, like the worlds and settings they created.
Set pieces. Yeah.
There's a lot of them. They're very clearly defined and delineated from each other. Nothing seems recycled. It's really immersive. Mm-hmm. And it's colorful and it's creative. So it just makes such a giant impression when you see it. And as you said, I mean, there are special effects, but I think they were smart with this movie in a way that some other movies aren't, possibly even the other one we're reviewing today at times, where you're using them sparingly based on the constraints that you have available. And I think that helps it out as well.
Yeah.
Visually, I can't say enough, but I'm going to stop right there.
All right.
Score of 9. Now, we talked to performances in this movie. I got to go down a little bit. And, it's not that anybody shit the bed or anything. It's just that the fact that there's a range of performance quality means you kind of have to take the average. And Von Sydow clearly is among the top of the cast. A very traditional, very veteran presence. It's kind of one of the parallels to me between the two films that we're discussing today, where you have an actor who likes acting as the main villain. Mm-hmm. And that shows here. Now, yeah, like you said, Sam Jones is not going to win any awards. He's not really even going to be the main draw almost in his title character's movie. No. And maybe you go in for that, but you're very quickly shown that that's not among the best of what's on offer here. The supporting cast is strong. I'm always a Dalton fan, so that works very well here, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see him among the cast. This was my first time seeing Brian Blessed perform. You could tell he was sort of given free rein here. He was given the license to go play and have fun. And it seems like he enjoyed every second. and that's fun to watch.
It fits right into the tone of this movie. Absolutely. It may not be right for everything, but it works here very well.
Yeah, this was the ideal, playground for that to happen. For me, Nella Muti as the Ming's daughter, Princess Aura, she is a presence. She's not super skilled as an actress, but she kind of I don't want to say dominates the scenes that she's in, but her presence is unmistakable.
Yeah, I didn't mention her in the cast, but she has a severity to her.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the best possible way.
Yeah.
Where she has a magnetic presence. You're right.
And it relies on sexuality as a lot of these things do, but I think what she brings to the scenes go beyond that for me. And I don't know, it just kind of sticks with you. Mm-hmm. For the writing, I got to go down to 6.5. There are there are some memorable lines here. So dialogue isn't really the problem for me. It's more of the clearness, the succinctness of the story being told. There are parts when it gets a little muddy. There are parts when it gets a little awkward to follow. I think maybe tightening some of that up, trimming a scene or two here, not fleshing out certain scenes so much, and maybe fleshing out others a little more.
It has that serial structure.
Yeah.
Like a serialized kind of very similar to Star Wars action, which is clearly inspired by the original Flash Gordon. So, but I think you're right. If you lose track of the overall plot line because you're in one little serialized episode a little bit too long or too much, it can take away from it. So I understand what you're saying there.
Like you expect some of that because I mean that's what they're inspired by. That's what is powering this whole thing. But yeah, you have to kind of keep in mind that this is one movie version of that.
Yeah.
And, like you said, try not to get lost. So 6.5 overall for me. When it comes to the audio, 7 overall for me. As you mentioned, this is famously associated with the fact that Queen provides most of the soundtrack and certainly the memorable theme song, which, for my tastes, is overused. They get their money's worth and they get their mileage. Not even just from the song as a whole or like recognizable pieces, but like just in like the beginning motif of it. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
Like, that is 90% of the audio, the music in this movie. And it's effective, but it's also maybe a little monotonous at some points.
Sure.
That said, though, what a kind of an innovative move for the time to get a rock band to provide your soundtrack.
Yeah.
In years after this movie was made, I mean, that's so common, like you can't even conceive of a world without it. But I think at the time, and if it wasn't the first, it was certainly among the first to do that. And I think that's why it made such a big impression. It just doesn't. It's memorable. The soundtrack more so than the score for me. I don't really come away with. I'm not humming like anything that the movie itself provided, other than like the pop music from Queen. So it's nice, but it just doesn't rise above a 7. There we have 9, 7, 6.5, and 7 for my scores for Flash Gordon.
All right, so that's one set of scores, and when we come back, we're going to have another. All right, as I said, we are back with another set of scores, this time for Masters of the Universe, and this time, Claude's up first.
Well, this is an interesting movie, both in terms of timing in pop culture, timing in my personal life, and coming up with scores. However, I managed to pull it off. And the first one I have is I'm giving the visuals an 8. And while they're not as impressive as Flash Gordon, I think within the structure of the movie itself, they're still pretty impressive. And then especially if you look into the production history of this movie and the Canon Company at the time, it is nearly a miracle that this movie exists, let alone that it exists looking even halfway decent.
Yeah.
And I think it goes above halfway decent. Really great matte paintings, really great costume design, ambitious effects, but probably riding the line of, pushing the limits of what they had available. This Canon movie doesn't get into the absurd visually as others have.
It's no Hercules.
No. And even Superman 4 from the same year, unfortunately, suffers much more than this movie ended up doing. I like this for what it is. I like the way most things look. It is notable for visually departing from the source material quite a bit, and that is always a source of negative critique from hardcore fans. However, being that I was 5 years old when this came out, and Being a He-Man fan prior to this, I wasn't locked in, I guess, in a way that you become when you're older, and was able to kind of accept it for what it was. And to me, it looked great. It looked like, for the most part, this hero from TV come to life in a bigger way. Some of the effects include what you'd consider to be creature effects, and I think that it's in the costuming realm, but it kind of goes a little bit above that. And while some of the creature characters in this movie are on screen pretty briefly, I think they make a strong impact, and I think that they are performed and executed really well. So with that said, again, my score is an 8. For performances, you can kind of carry it from the visuals, and the people in those costumes mostly did a pretty admirable job. So I give the performances a 7. Again, taking into account the average of what you're seeing, it's a range. Dolph Lundgren as He-Man in the title role, again, much like Sam Jones as Flash Gordon, ultimately probably isn't among the best of what is on display here. I think he, against all odds, probably pulls it off a little better than Sam Jones.
Interesting, yeah.
If not for any other reason than just being more visually and characterally interesting to look at. Maybe it's sometimes the car accident effect or the train wreck effect that can't look away. He was famously pretty new to not necessarily the English language, but for having to speak much dialogue on film. He had done Rocky IV before this, and I think we all know the lines were kept to a minimum for a reason. But in this movie, he's given the lead role, and that comes with a decent amount of dialogue. And he insisted on doing it himself because they were going to dub it.
Yeah.
So I think they gave him a couple tries, and he. I don't know that necessarily the tries were a result of to motivate him, or because they simply couldn't afford more time. But either way, mostly he pulls it off. However, Frank Langella, of course, as Skeletor, is the showpiece here. It's like someone took his Shakespeare stage dial and not turned it to 11, but actually turned it so hard they broke it off. And that's not in any way a negative comment. It's to all of our entertainment. But not enough, I think, is said about Meg Foster as Evelyn. Visually, she's perfect casting, and those ridiculously piercing eyes and everything. The costume is great and accentuates that. But her performance is just great. Is just so cold and menacing, but in a subtle way. It's almost the perfect counterpart from a villain standpoint to Langella's over-the-top approach to Skeletor. It's kind of an ensemble piece, so that provides, as I said, a range of other performances. Billy Barty is always entertaining as Gwildor. Behind the performances is the writing. And I score that as a 7 as well. Not, again, because of the strength of the overall story, but probably for the strength of the dialogue. I do think the story here is a little stronger, a little easier to follow, a little more clearly plotted out than in Flash Gordon. But it receives rightful criticism for kind of, I guess you could say it's a crutch in movies where a space movie or a fantasy movie comes to Earth. It's most likely due to budget constraints. But again, having seen this at an impressionable age, it worked for me. It's a little, as viewing it through an adult eyes, it's a little frustrating. It's a little kind of disheartening that we didn't get to see more of the more fantastic settings and things like that. But what is here kind of provides a really interesting backdrop for these characters to play against. Fish out of water is a trope and it's overused, but something about the way they execute it here just entertains me. I when I see a movie and I still use lines from it in my day-to-day life, 20, 30, 40 years later, to me that just, it speaks to the strength of the dialogue and the memorability of the quotes in that movie. I do use many from this movie, but it's situational, so it would be kind of difficult to explain them. So then I'll just move on to the audio and also give that a 7. And that's mostly, well, it's the exact opposite of Flash Gordon, where for me the score here provides all of the musical memorability in this film. The legendary composer Bill Conti is providing the score, and in some ways this is a pretty derivative work for him, for his body of work. It's basically a mashup of Star Wars and Superman thematically, but within that framework he is able to provide a theme that is memorable to my ears, at least to this day, that I find myself humming. Not just the main theme for the movie, but the sound for the cosmic key. When that powers up, it plays a specific melody, and the melody is actually a key part of the plot in the movie. Remembering that so they can get back to Eternia. So I got to give it up for Bill Conti, and my scores for Masters of the Universe: 8, and then straight 7, 7, 7, 7.
All right. So I'm up. I'm just going to start with visuals the same. Close to your score, a little lower. I'm going 7.5. You kind of hinted at some of the reasons why. I think at its highest points, this film is equal to something like Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
A lot of that costume design, especially, even some of the set design, the set pieces in Eternia, all of that stuff looks pretty great. But again, you do lean on that, probably mostly budgetary issue of immediately leaving that. Leave that behind as quickly as you can, and you end up on Earth. The Cosmic Key is a cool, different thing. It was a unique Deus Ex Machina. So I give it credit for that, but it still gets a little bit of a downgrade from something like Flash Gordon because it wasn't able to commit to that little bit of a higher concept for the duration. And again, that could have been budgetary. The budgets were very similar, but this is a more recent movie, so you have an inflation issue there. They came up a little bit short, I think, of what they wanted. At its highest point, very, very good. Just has a little bit more of it has a little bit of a wider spectrum of its high points and low points. So 7.5 overall for visuals. Performances, I go down a half point below you. I go to 6.5. Everybody pretty much holds it together here. We always say 6 is about the level that's good. Right. This gets a little boost, largely on the strength of some of the positives that you mentioned. Langella's sort of over-the-top performance, and Meg Foster's sort of, again, kind of a severe presence. And so there's some similarities between the Aura character in Flash Gordon and the Evelyn character in this film. I do like the dichotomy between the two characters because it's almost like Skeletor is the visionary and Evelyn is like, she's got to make it happen. She's got to be the utilitarian, she's the project coordinator and Langella's the CEO. So I do kind of like that, the interaction between those two. They're definitely the strength of the film. Lundgren's performance needs to be mentioned because, as you said, it's kind of, the acting quality is questionable, the line delivery is questionable, but he definitely presents his imposing physicality. He's known as kind of like a big muscle guy. Actually, usually he's not. In most films, he's just kind of big. Mostly he's just tall and kind of like, lean and long and beefy. But in this movie, he really got, he might have had a little help to get into that He-Man shape.
Some Eternian milkshake.
That's right. But yeah, his physical presence helps balance that out a little bit. But overall, I'm still going 6.5. So for writing for this film, again, I give it a pretty big downgrade. And this is where we divert the most from each other on today's show as our scores for writing. This movie's getting a 5 for me in writing, which is below the mark of good. Again, I do think you're right. I do think the plot is a little bit simpler, easy to follow. It's a little bit more efficient in this film than Flash Gordon's. It's not trying to create that serialized storytelling, so that kind of maybe helps it stay simple. And again, I think that the writing is a victim of the budgetary constraints, where you had to take it out of Eternia, and then you had to lean on those cliches, those fish out of water cliches, those
Yeah.
kind of well-worn things. You know, in the first season of the show, we did Starman with Jeff Bridges. You know, so you have these kinds of things sort of repeating in Hollywood, in movies, in storytelling. And so this movie's leaning on that a little bit. And again, it's a little bit clunky. So I'm giving it a 5. Again, overall, I like this movie. My other scores are pretty good. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it's an unenjoyable movie. All right, so for audio, I am going 6.5. You know, again, it's better than good. The soundtrack, the score that is high quality. You mentioned all of its high points. I don't think that this one quite matches the quality of Conti's other work.
Agreed.
The cosmic key issue is interesting. Again, that's kind of a cool, unique take. The only other thing I can think of that kind of goes down a road like that is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That's how you communicate with the aliens. So interesting approach, kind of unique. It's only been done a couple times, to the best of my knowledge. So that kind of gives it a little bit of a boost. But otherwise, I find the soundtrack and the score mostly to just sort of be serviceable. So that doesn't mean bad. It just means it's not going to get any sort of extra scoring for quality. But it does get that little half-point boost because of its unique approach with the cosmic key element. So those are my scores for Masters of the Universe: 7.5, 6.5, 5, 6.5. When we come back, we're going to have the big board out, and we're going to have some final scores. All right, we're back, and we have the big board, and we're ready to talk about some final scoring. Masters of the Universe gets a final score of 6.82, and Flash Gordon gets the win with a final score of 7.26. So there you have it. Claude, any thoughts about these scores?
For my personal taste, these don't necessarily reflect exactly how I feel. But, as we always say, that's the whole point of our scoring system. And I can't argue with these scores because ultimately they're very reflective of kind of what is deserved here. And I will say that another part of the inspiration for comparing these two movies is while I was watching Flash Gordon for the first time, I couldn't help but think, wait a minute, this is He-Man. Or at least what He-Man wanted to be.
Yeah.
And there's still room for Flash Gordon to improve and expand. But given the time, I think that if the Masters of the Universe film were to have been able to achieve something like Flash Gordon, probably most of the people involved would have been happier, and certainly most of the audience.
Yeah.
But they're very similar in subject matter and presentation.
Yeah, they have a lot of similarities. I mean, that's why they end up facing each other on the show. I agree with you. I think Flash Gordon is the film. It kind of represents what the Masters of the Universe film maybe was aiming for.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately what for me, these, first of all, I should say that these scores do reflect my feeling. Mm-hmm. I find both of these movies enjoyable to watch. And I went into both. Now, I also had not seen Masters of the Universe until very recently, the last few years. Wow. I had never sat through the whole thing. So both of these movies are recent watches. Neither have strong nostalgia for me. And I wasn't actually a huge He-Man fan as a kid. I was all about Transformers and Thundercats. I know. I liked He-Man just fine, but I was kind of more focused on those other two properties for whatever reason.
Sure.
So I didn't carry a lot of that baggage into viewing the movie. And I stayed away from both these movies for a long time for various reasons. One, I don't like fish out of water stories, and I knew that He-Man moved to the real world, and I stayed away from it for that reason for a long time. And there was a time where I didn't appreciate the camp of something like Flash Gordon. I wanted it to be more serious, and I thought it was a cheap, low-budget bit of nonsense. That's what I thought for a long time, and that's why. And I was wrong. I was very, very wrong.
And Flash Gordon technically is like a reverse fish out of water story.
It's true. But it takes place in the high concepts world, which is what I wanted more of. Sure. But both of these movies are very enjoyable to watch, much better than I expected either of them to be. These final scores represent more of my thoughts on them. I think ultimately what it comes down to is Flash Gordon as a film is able to maintain its ambition I think it meets its ambition and maintains it through the course of the movie more consistently than Masters of the Universe is able to.
Right.
I think Masters of the Universe at times meets its ambition and at times falls short. And it's not all the movie's fault. We've talked about the failure of canon,
Right.
the uneven support that the film got from Mattel, the toy maker. So
Yeah.
these things did sort of cost it in the end. But in the end, you kind of can't give too many bonus points for the difficulty.
Right.
The film is what the film is.
You go by what's on screen.
Yes, exactly. And so I think ultimately Flash Gordon maintains its vision more consistently, and that's what gives it the boost. If Masters of the Universe was able to maintain itself what it was for the first portions of the movie,
Yeah.
I think that would end up sort of getting a higher score as long as it was able to meet that ambition and not fall short. It did the best it could with what it had, and it's a successful movie, I think. It's fun to watch, I should say. Success is another conversation, but I enjoy viewing both films. But yeah, I think these scores represent my thoughts on where they should be, and I think that the elements that I just described are the reason why the scores end up the way they are.
It's it's as fair as you can possibly be.
All right. So that's another episode of Nerd Bomber versus Movies. You can find us on social media. The best place to go is Instagram at NerdBomberPod. The show's on YouTube, but you are already here watching it, so you must already know that. So I have... for your friend Claude, I've been Just Jamie, and until the next battle...
Good journey.
Please deposit litter in trash receptacles as you exit the auditorium. Thanks for visiting with us. Buckle up and drive safely. See you next week.